Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. This week, we're going to be looking at the meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Central Asia. Is the no-limit partnership, in fact, more limited than Vladimir Putin counted for? Then we'll take a look at what will happen to Britain after Queen Elizabeth II has left office and the funeral will be here on Monday. After the funeral, King Charles III will take over. What will happen to Britain? What will happen to the Union? What will happen to the Commonwealth and to Britain's relations with the world? And finally, a look at the amazing Ukrainian advance in the Northeast, in which Ukraine in 5 days acquired more territory back from the Russians than the Russians were able to achieve in the last 5 months. What does this mean for the war in Ukraine? And what does it mean for Vladimir Putin? Here to talk about all of this are Elise Labbott from Washington, D.C. Elise is founder of Zivi Media and editor-in-chief of Zivi Media. Elise, wonderful to have you back.
Great to be here.
And from London, Philip Stevens, contributing editor to the Financial Times. Philip, wonderful to have you back.
Great to be back. Thanks.
And Giles Whittell, also from London, is the World Affairs editor at Tortoise Media. Wonderful to have you back here as well.
Thanks.
Giles, let's start with you. We have the meeting that happened yesterday between Putin and Xi. It was, some pictures showed them sitting very far apart with some kind of very strange coffin in the middle. It was quite a scene. But apart from the photography, what really was happening was quite remarkable. A partnership that had no limits, turns out, may have some limits. Bring us up to date about what happened in the meeting, and importantly, the degree to which China and Russia see the world in the same way, or may in fact be differing quite a bit about how they want to move forward.
Yeah, well, what a difference 6 months make. Ivo, first of all, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to talk about something other than what we're going to get on to talk about, which has been swamping us here in London this past week, with all due respect to the people concerned. You'll remember 6 months ago, Putin travels to Beijing for the opening ceremony of the Beijing Winter Olympics. He's almost the only world leader of any stature there. They sign this sort of blood brothers pact, no limit pact. And then I remember he falls asleep in the stadium. Such was his ennui and his power at that point. Only he knew then that he was about to launch what he hoped would be a blitzkrieg across Ukraine to sweep into Kyiv, reunite the two lobes of Russia as he sees it. We'll get on to how that's turned out. But since then, he's been isolated by sanctions. China throughout has been the closest thing he had to a really significant, powerful ally. But this past 6 months for China too have been torrid. Economically, as we were discussing just before we started, zero COVID has been a sort of a lid on economic recovery. As the rest of the world emerges from the pandemic, Xi has been more or less unable to. The question then, 6 months into this no limits pact, is do they still need each other now as much as they did 6 months ago? And the answer is no. Putin arrived needing Xi very much more than vice versa. He said in what was broadcast of their meeting across this large floral coffin, "We hear your concerns." This was the first time the world had heard Putin acknowledge that his closest ally had concerns, obviously, about the war, although that was not explicit at the time. The question then was what would Xi say in public or private? And it's what he didn't say that is so crucial about the Samarkand meeting. There has been no promise, obviously, of weapons, of ammunition, which Russia is now having to buy from North Korea, of all places, and no endorsement, no explicit endorsement of the special military operation. And so the third point that I think is really worth making about the dynamics of this meeting is what Xi's real agenda in Samarkand was. It was to telegraph to Putin his disapproval of the war, which is going so badly. But it was also to play his part in chapter 3 or 33 of the Great Game. Central Asia used to be one of my stomping grounds many years ago. It's fascinating to see how periodically Russia, or in a past century, Great Britain, in this case now China, moves into that area for raw materials or just geopolitical influence. And just 3 quick points. Before Xi arrived in Samarkand, he had this very quick but very cordial meeting with the new leader of Kazakhstan, where he guaranteed Kazakhstan's territorial integrity. There's been no explicit threat, but of course, Kazakhstan is a big neighbor. And just before the war started in February in Ukraine, there was a strange military expedition where a bunch of airborne Russian troops arrived by invitation to restore order on the streets of Almaty and what is going to be called Astana again. And then I heard that Uzbekistan telegraphed disapproval of the war by refusing to. The person they sent to meet Putin in Samarkand refused to shake his hand on the tarmac. And one final point, which I think is really interesting. We heard last week, remember Belt and Road, which is being sort of wound down in most parts of the world? We heard last week that they plan, despite the enormous cost, the Chinese, to build a new railway from Kashgar, basically, from Western China over the Torugat Pass, which is nearly 4,000 meters high, to a place that not many people have ever been to, the Kyrgyz Jalalabad. Now this is the old Silk Route, but it's not any new commercial axis. This is pump priming in sort of brute geopolitical infrastructure. To build a railway over the roof of the world there is pure power politics on China's part to get a physical presence back in Central Asia as Russia weakens. So I think, I mean, as you were saying, Ivo, I think that component of this summit in Samarkand of the Shanghai Cooperation Council is among the most interesting.
Giles, that's a great summary. Lots of things to unpack here. Philip, just starting with you, do you think Xi is now regretting the tight embrace that he had with Putin? This is the signal, and he's now starting to move out and say, you don't mean a hell of a lot to me other than cheap energy, which, of course, is part of the conversation that is going on. But we're not going to help you. You dug your own grave. We're not going to figure out how to get you out of there. And in the meantime, take advantage of Russian weakness in Central Asia. Is that part of the story we're seeing here?
I think it's part of the story, but I think we have to be careful about, moving too far and sort of reversing, saying in February, look, there's this grand new alliance, and then saying, come September, it's all broken up. I think there's a longer game played here. I think what we've seen this week is reinforcement of what we knew, but was slightly obscured in February, which is Russia is very much the junior partner in this arrangement. And although Xi talked about an alliance without limits, nothing was ever written down. And the Chinese were very careful that nothing was ever written down. And I think now, clearly the Chinese have been embarrassed by Putin's failure. They were led to believe and expected, I think, a short war in which Putin didn't win outright. He would basically end up on top. That's an embarrassment to China. But I think, if you look at the sort of, take a broader strategic view, China and Russia share the same basic objective, which is to challenge what they call the Western designed world order, the rules-based international order. And I don't think that's changed. I think, the Chinese will be very irritated with the Russians, but they're not going to throw them overboard. And I think they've been, as Giles said, they haven't been giving them weapons, but they have been supporting them diplomatically at the UN and elsewhere, and they have publicly been saying that NATO's to blame for the war. But I think the other point that Giles made is also a good one, that, you know, China's ambition is to be the Eurasian power, you know, the dominant Eurasian power. I remember the late Zip Brzezinski wrote about this very eloquently many years ago. Eurasia is the game. China has its focus on that. And Russia is now increasingly out of that game. There have been tensions before. I think Putin now will find it very difficult to push back. So in that sense, China actually wins something from Russia's weakness. So, you know, I think we should take comfort from the fact that that it's the evidence that this is a very lopsided partnership. But I don't think we should sort of celebrate its breakup, because it's going to be around for a while.
Yeah, no Sino-Soviet split like as we saw in the 60s, at least not yet.
Yeah.
Always good to be cautious on this thing. Elise, how does it look from Washington? Initially there was this fear that these two major powers are coming together and countering the United States, and we would be on the losing side. 6 months later, it doesn't all, the competition with China was real, but much rather be in the U.S. seat right now than in the Russian seat, at least. So how does it look from Washington?
Well, I think, if you remember, a few months ago, we had a very robust debate about whether the U.S. was going to be on the losing side of this China-Russia no limits partnership. And I said, if you look at, what's actually being translated into the partnership, it's not as great in terms of Chinese support for the Russians as you might think. They weren't letting China tap into the reserves. They weren't getting currency reserves. They weren't getting, or they weren't really kind of letting Russia circumvent the sanctions in a major way. They weren't giving them military aid. And so I thought that the partnership was, great in theory, but we would have to see. And now we're seeing the remnants of that, or the reverberations of that. And I think the U.S. sees this as a, kind of Chinese, very hesitant on the war in Ukraine. It's not doing very well. Russia looked like the weakened partner, and China doesn't want to be associated with that. And so I do think that this kind of partnership, this unbalance, in one way, I think is very good for the U.S. in terms of the war in Ukraine. And we'll talk more about that later. But I don't think it's good for, this kind of rise of China in terms of this strategic competition for global influence. If you do look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they're looking to admit Iran. And if, as Philip said, China wants to be the Eurasian partner. I mean, who would you really rather have, the Eurasian leader? Who would you rather have as the leader of Eurasia right now, Putin or Xi? And so as China, it's bad for the weakness is good for China. And in some ways, I think it's a mixed bag for the United States. I mean, China is definitely more the dominant partner. And if you see, we've talked about, is there going to be this kind of axis where, you have the West and everyone is supporting Ukraine. And then do you have this other axis of India, Pakistan, Turkey, Iran, all siding with Russia and China? It doesn't really matter how powerful Russia is. China is still expanding its dominance. So I think in the short term, it's good for the United States. In the long term, as China expands its influence, I'm not sure it really helps that kind of long-term grand strategic cooperation that Biden talked about since his first day in office. And I think it's more of a tactical success that this summit didn't go off as well as Putin wanted it to for the U.S. But in the long term, I think we're still not dealing with that big grand cooperation competition with China that was, always supposed to be a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy.
No, absolutely. I think a smart and effective relationship between China and the United States continues to deteriorate with the post-Pelosi visit, no conversations on climate, on military talks, etc. It's still deeply tense. Giles, I want to come back for one moment to Central Asia and the region, because we had two incidences that demonstrated that the reduction in Russian influence in the region, plus where China is starting to play a role, may lead to some pretty unstable developments in Central Asia. Fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan, nothing new, but about 100 people were killed in border clashes there. And then what was it? Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan shooting at the border. I might have actually gotten them wrong. I think it's. I
think that was Tajikistan against Kyrgyz border troops.
Right. So again, this kind of. This kind of turmoil that is happening there in a region that, a lot of us don't pay attention to, but a lot of people in Russia and China pay attention. Of course, the people in the region pay attention to. Is there a dynamic here that may affect the stability of this whole region?
Yes. Those two upsurges of violence, brief as they were reminders that when you don't have a strong hegemon who is seen as strong in the region, all hell can break loose all over the place. One of the big surprises about the post-Soviet decade was that Central Asia remained relatively quiet. That is former Soviet Central Asia, the stans. But of course, the opposite was true in the Caucasus. The opposite was true in former Yugoslavia. Opportunistic attacks by Azerbaijan against Armenia showed just what can happen once they smell weakness in the north, in Russia. I don't know exactly what happened between Tajikistan, which is notionally still in Moscow's camp, and Kyrgyzstan, which has spent most of the past 30 years trying to build some kind of a democracy. But that can be seen as in some sense a proxy for a wider struggle. I just say one thing. I take Elise's point about the long-term significance of the past 6 months from the US's point of view, not being great, that this is an opportunity for China principally. But you framed this debate, Ivo, as is there a new world order? A new world order, to survive, to thrive, needs an ideology, it needs money, and it needs military power. The ideology of a sort of results-based over a rules-based world order, it's not looking good. Results are not forthcoming. Money, the Russian economy is entirely circumscribed by sanctions now, and we've talked a lot about Xi's economic problems. And military power, look at the kit. Look how, it turns out that the sort of intellectually dilettante liberal Democrats of the West, they make far better weapons, far more effective weapons than Russia, which chose to use them. And who is Russia's biggest customer of military hardware? China. They've got bad kit. And this has been a very bad advert for war from China's point of view as well. They will think twice about a quick military strike on Taiwan as a result.
Yeah, I think that's a good warning. If I were in the PLA, in the Chinese army, and looking at the ability of the Ukrainians with good training and good weapons to thwart Russian arms, and that the Russians now need to rely on Iran and North Korea as their main supplier of weapons, it's a pretty devastating picture to paint. But we'll come back to Ukraine in a minute and the war, which I think demonstrates part of Giles' point. But let's move on to what's dominating, not just in Britain, but frankly, newspapers and television screens around the world. The death of Queen Elizabeth II, 96 years old, 71-year reign, the longest reign any monarch in probably in the world, but certainly in the British monarchy. Has come to an end. We are watching with great interest, many of us, what is happening. I only facetiously asked Philip and Giles whether they have been standing in line, but not yet. I'm told, but maybe this weekend. Who knows? In London, but there is a bigger picture here. It has a feeling, Philip, that a pause button was hit when she died, and that will be hit again after her funeral. And all of a sudden, all of the reality of the world and the reality in Britain will come rushing back. and some very big foreign policy, big domestic policy issues, of course, but also big foreign policy issues will all of a sudden return without, in some ways, the glue that the Queen has been able to provide for the king, for the nation, and towards its relationship with the rest of the world.
I think that's absolutely spot on, Ivo. I mean, it's as if it's a sort of dense, deep emotional mist has descended on the country and obscured all reality. And, this is a reflection of sort of genuinely deep sadness and sorrow among millions of people, a reflection of, of just the understanding what an epochal change this is for, here is a head of state who has spanned, if you like, the transition from Britain. She was, an empress effectively when she came to the throne, and now we're a medium-sized European power. She spanned that era, and so this is a big moment. I think it was George Orwell who said, famously that the Brits are a terribly disputatious people, but they come together at sort of moments of emotional crisis, and there's a sort of togetherness forged for a moment. But you're right, and we'll see that over the next few days as presidents and emperors, in the case of Japan, and kings and queens descend on London for the funeral. And no one does pomp and pageantry better than the British. That's the one thing I think we can say that we're still a world leader on. It is very, very impressive. But, come Tuesday, and the world and the country that faces our new King, Charles III, that transition's been remarkably smooth. The old sort of, the king is, or the queen is dead, long live the king, which is designed to glide from one to the other, has worked its magic for the moment. Now, Britain wakes up on Tuesday morning facing three sets of really big problems. One, the economy. Every indicator is flashing red. Growth, the trade deficit, debt, borrowing, inflation, we're all doing badly. And we forget that Liz Truss, the new prime minister, who's deeply inexperienced in all of this, but has very firm views, drawn actually from the Reaganomics of the 1980s. It's odd to say, but true. So she has to cope with that. We have this moment of togetherness has basically disguised the fact that the union of the United Kingdom itself is under deep strain. Scotland's looking more and more towards the possibility of independence. Northern Ireland's been destabilized both by the argument that Britain's having with the European Union about trading arrangements and the fact that the nationalist or Catholic community demographics is doing its business, as it were, and the unionists might well this year begin to feel that we'll be in technically a minority. So the worry there is, how strong is the peace, and is the possibility of a transition to United Ireland going to destabilize things further? And then the third thing is our place in the world. It occurred to me it's 50 years since Dean Acheson's famous remark about us losing an empire and failing to find a role. And that's where we still are. We have this, the government has this sort of pretension of global Britain. But in fact, we've pulled ourselves out of Europe because of the argument over Northern Ireland, where we're not cooperating politically on security matters, let alone in terms of trade and investment. So we're sort of pretty much isolated in Europe. I mean, the government, Boris Johnson and now Liz Truss, have been very strong on Ukraine, so that's a bit of an exception. But otherwise, we're pretty much lost. And there's a big question now to what extent the Commonwealth, which was very much the Queen Elizabeth's project as it were. She managed that transition from empire to Commonwealth. How much it will hold together, and how many of the 14 states who keep the monarchy as their head of state will continue to do so. We saw a year ago that Barbados decided to become a republic. Jamaica, Antigua, these debates are going on. Australia, the debate, I'm sure, will revive. So, the glue in the Commonwealth, and to the extent that the Commonwealth was anything more than a sort of friendly association, even that's beginning to weaken. So, all three fronts, the economy, the strength of its eternal political structures, and our place in the world. Britain, the outlook in the short term, at least, looks pretty bleak. And we don't, frankly, have a government that so far, but it's, early days, looks as if it's of the stature, caliber to deal with these problems.
Well, that's a pretty bleak outlook, Elise, and imagine you're Liz Truss and you've just been briefed. She's only been in power for what? Not even 12 days or so.
Actually, I'm just going to come back to it.
Yeah.
They don't like bad news. The Treasury Permanent Secretary, that's the top official in the Treasury, who was warning them and produced the briefing paper saying things are going to get really tough, was summarily fired by Liz Truss last week. So they don't like bad news.
That's great for politicians. The reality is sometimes the reality interferes. But at least the U.S. has long looked to Britain as a critical partner in Europe. It's certainly a critical partner on the issue of Ukraine, which we'll talk about in a minute. A very special relationship between the Queen and presidents of the United States, between Americans who are watching what is happening in Britain, almost with the same kind of bated breath that we are seeing in London. How do you think the challenges that Philip points out, but also this fundamental change of an era is going to have an effect on the way the United States will relate to the United Kingdom?
Well, I think it's interesting, as we were talking about before we started the show today, that the flags are flying at half staff in honor of the Queen, and to kind of mark her death, because it is a sad day for the U.S. She's this one leader. Obviously, you have the quote unquote special relationship, and we could talk about how special it is now with Britain. But we certainly had this special relationship with the Queen for the last 70 years, this consistency. And so, I think it's a nice gesture in terms of how important this woman was to the U.S. British relationship and to the U.S. in general. But when Queen Elizabeth assumed the throne, it was the kind of sunsetting on the British Empire. And now if you look at some of these kind of post-World War II, three circles that Philip was talking about, Britain's influence in the world, the Commonwealth, the Union, the United States, and its relationship with the United States, they're all kind of, the sun is also setting on a lot of those now that Britain is not in the EU. In one hand, it's good for the United States, because if the U.S. is at odds with the EU on certain policies, Britain, we know, generally is going to side with the United States. Obviously, in the EU, it's not as powerful, and the Union is in trouble. And now the Commonwealth is really just kind of a family of nations of like-minded values that used to be part of the British Empire, and now we're just kind of friends, if you will. And certainly we'll have to see what happens. A lot of these countries, as Philip said, are moving towards becoming republics, or will in the next few years. I think it's going to be really interesting to see the relationship between King Charles and the United States. As we know, one of his core issues is the environment and climate. That's something that's very important, at least to President Biden in the short term. And, something that, economically is a real headache for Liz Truss, who's trying to really, the economy, as we've talked about, is not doing well. And that does, Charles is talking about spending a lot of money on climate initiatives. So I think the U.S. will see a friend in King Charles, but, again, he doesn't have all that much power. So, does the relationship become more friendly on some like-minded issues, but in terms of US British influence, it's really waning. And so I think Britain is a kind of go-to US partner, but its influence and its power and its prowess is becoming a lot less important. And you've heard that from US officials. I mean, obviously, we know we can count on the Brits, but what does counting on the Brits really mean? Certainly in Ukraine, it'll means a lot, but on other issues across the board, it still remains to be seen.
I mean, just on that latter point, even on Ukraine, I've heard senior U.S. officials saying that was very nice for Liz Truss to call for a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, but would they also fund it? It was, and that was meant not facetiously. It was actually meant. Where's the beef in that particular case, Giles? Is there one? Do you agree basically with Philip's sort of outline of the challenges confronting the nation? But then, secondly, do people in Westminster take this analysis seriously, and are they willing and able to deal with it, or are they going to say, no, it's just not true, we're just going to deal with it, the reality that we wish, rather than the reality as it is, both in economic and in Europe Union policy and in foreign policy in terms of the EU and perhaps even the Commonwealth? How do you think Westminster and Whitehall is dealing with these challenges, given that politics has really taken a sort of a backseat while people were waiting who the next prime minister was going to be? How is the political class going to deal with this challenge?
Right. First of all, yes, I share Philip's general gloom, which prompts in me a sort of student debating urge to play devil's advocate, which I will briefly in just a second. How will Westminster respond? I think the new political intake, the new occupants of numbers 10 and 11 and the ministries, too soon to tell because of the Queen's death, which has just put everything on ice, as you said. But senior civil service, Philip mentioned the sacking of Tom Scholar. I think that is probably will send shockwaves of despair through a managerial class which has frankly been firefighting ever since 2016. They've been on the back foot, crisis management, ever since we embarked on the project known as Brexit, which is a monstrous make work project in which the bottom line was always going to suffer, in which the national pie was always going to shrink. But I would just say on Commonwealth, Europe, and the special relationship, you can look at it all in a different way. And I suspect that Truss and co do. The Commonwealth has always demanded very little of its members, given very little to its members. As Elise said, been a collection of friends. And I imagine it will go on doing that precisely because the stakes aren't that high. It's absolutely true that Charles is nowhere near as admired, loved, or gluey as the Queen. But since 2018, he's been the de facto head of the Commonwealth, and he'll give it a go. The special relationship, my experience in Washington was that, and it's very kind of you guys over in the States to say that it's special and to say that you can always trust the Brits, but it always has felt to me as if we are by far the needier partner in that relationship. I won't bore you with stories of brush buys in basement kitchens at Unger and sort of desperate number 10 stuff, but I suspect that will happen again. Europe, you've heard, you can intuit my views on that, but let's remember that Truss, her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, her Business Secretary Philip Rees-Mogg are caricatured as having a vision of Britain in this difficult future to which we're heading. They sometimes call it global Britain. Critics sometimes call it Singapore on Thames. That's where we're headed. As the Union, the British Union weakens, you are reduced to thinking about a sort of nationalist English rump. How does it fund itself? Well, we had a clue just a few days ago when number 10 or number 11 confirmed your newspaper's report, Philip, that they're going to aim to take advantage of Brexit to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. This is where we're headed. It would be wonderful if Charles's views on climate were going to strengthen a relationship with Biden. I hope that they do have that conversation because A, it will put climate briefly in the headlines where it deserves to be, and B, it will weaken the monarchy because it really isn't the kind of thing that he should be talking about. But
it will strengthen his relationship with the Commonwealth, though. A lot of these countries, like climate, is a very important issue to them. So, like, even if they decide to move to the Republic, the whole idea of Commonwealth, I think they do see an ally with him on the climate issue.
Fascinating. Yeah, there is a three C's, a coming climate clash between the king and the prime minister. And yeah, you're right. He'll find friends in some interesting places. But I think in terms of brute power and important policy signals, and I'd be interested to know what Philip thinks, that lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses indicates direction of travel.
I think it does. I think, we're going to see the government's new economic strategy tested to destruction quite quickly, because next week there's going to be a mini budget in which the government's response to all this crisis is going to be pretty big tax cuts, one for corporations and two, reversing some tax cuts on individuals and employees. Now, that's at a time when borrowing is shooting up because of the energy crisis and for other reasons. Why, when the government wants to spend more money on defense, when the trade deficit is getting to pretty historically high levels, and as we've seen again, when sterling is falling on the foreign exchange markets, and now the dollar's been rising against everything, but sterling's been falling faster than other currencies. Now, that to me, someone who many years ago used to write about economics, is you sort of throw in big tax cuts and you're inviting the markets to say, Britain is heading for an inflationary bust and let's sell sterling even more. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that famous American economist, Arthur Laffer from the 1980s, was right when he said that if you cut taxes for the rich, everyone will benefit. They'll pay more tax and the money will trickle down. I'm a bit skeptical about that sort of economics, but that's what we're going to get. It's going to be an experiment. I think the key point that Giles has made is that, we're heading for England. The Conservative Party has become the party of English nationalism. And I'm not, the party that used to be conservative, small c, used to be interested in preserving the traditions and the institutions and values of the United Kingdom, I think has lost interest in those. And in fact, it's attacking them, from the civil service to the church, to the BBC, to the courts. So I think we are on this trajectory. We're heading for England, or England and Wales, and Charles will reign over the Kingdom of England and Wales if we keep on in this trajectory, which I hope we don't.
Empires come and go, they say. We'll find out whether the empire, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland will remain for a little longer. But it's a challenge for any political leader, no matter how good they are. We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to really pivot back, at least to Ukraine. We had a really remarkable couple of weeks in terms of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the north, which few people expected. It went better than, frankly, almost anybody thought it would go, and it really has rattled Moscow in a pretty significant way. Bring us up to date about where we are today, and where do you think this is going? Or do you think we can continue to see this kind of military offensive, a collapse of Russian forces, talking about a collapse of empire, and what is the disquiet in Moscow going to lead to? More escalation, less? How do you see it?
Well, I mean, you had this amazing kind of two-pronged offensive. Obviously, Russia expected that there was going to be this long-awaited push on Kherson in the south. And so that's where they kind of directed their manpower. Meanwhile, nobody, obviously the Ukrainians and their U.S. partners knew that the Ukrainians launched a second offensive up near Kyiv to retake that area and really caught Putin's troops by surprise. They've captured about 3,000 or so square kilometers of territory.
Square miles.
More than, excuse me?
Square miles, yeah.
Square miles. More than any time in the war. They seem to be for now holding on to the territory. And their goal is to kind of isolate Russian forces in the south while they continue to retake other areas. And this was just an amazing offensive, really coordinated with the United States. They kind of started letting the U.S. in on their plans a few months ago. The combination of the increased U.S. and European arms and also tactical intelligence, tactical military planning with U.S. planners. I mean, the U.S. says it doesn't want to go to war with Russia, but they certainly are helping Ukraine strategize and strategize these offensives, remarkably offensive. And it's, Zelensky wants to show his European backers in the United States that their arms are being put to good use, that they can capture territory, especially before the winter when it's going to get cold and Russia's going to really put the squeeze on, energy to Europe. And it's given the Ukrainian forces this confidence that they've been able to kind of learn to use to be successful in all of these new technologies that the U.S. is giving them. And it's really put Russia on the back foot. It's hurt morale from soldiers. You see now Russian soldiers just kind of putting down their weapons and walking away. Others are kind of disguising themselves, taking bicycles from the Ukrainians, putting on Ukrainian, stealing clothing from Ukrainians and just trying to get out. They're demoralized. They're hungry. They're outgunned right now. Russians are scrambling to get reinforcements in, but it's really, as the morale of the Ukrainians increases, the morale of the Russians is really spiraling. And it's changing the whole momentum of the war. And sometimes that momentum is really all you need. I mean, the U.S. is, and the Ukrainians are saying, look, we can't celebrate yet. We still have a lot of work to do. And certainly the Russians are going to start bringing in more reinforcements. But certainly, we've talked over the course of the war when Ukraine has kind of, retaken an area. We say, the momentum is changing. Can they really win this? But I think more now that at any time, the Ukrainians are feeling really good about where they are. And now I think, now as they move more towards Kherson in the south, it's really to kind of choke off the Russians, retake a lot of the areas of the Donbass. The Russians are starting to introduce the ruble in the area. There's talk about a kind of sham referendum in Kherson. So now the Ukrainians are kind of really going to focus their attention on Kherson and the southern part of the country. The question is, can they hold on to the territory they have while they still continue to launch this offensive in the south?
I think that's exactly the big thing. It's there's still 20% of territory still in Russian hands. There's still a lot of Russian soldiers there, even though, as you rightly said, a lot of them fled.
But 20%, I mean, how much percent? Like we thought, everyone thought Russia was just going to roll in and kind of take over the country. And that hasn't happened by any means.
Well, clearly, it's now clear that Russia cannot win this war. The question is, how quickly is it going to lose the war, if it is going to lose the war? We only have a minute left. Philip, I wanted to just, what do you think is happening in Moscow, and how worried should Vladimir Putin be? He's just lost his Chinese friend in some significant way. What is going to happen inside Putin?
Well, he's got to be very worried. I think you're right. This war isn't going to end tomorrow. It's going to go on for a long time. But the other, if you like, really good news, I think, is that it now looks as if Europe will survive the absence of Russian gas through the winter. I mean, things could change, but all the signs are that the peak, the gas price may now be at its peak, and the storage tanks are full. And the second thing is that for all the arguments that still go on about are the Germans doing enough, are the French doing enough, Europe is holding together and acting purposefully. And we saw today the Germans are effectively nationalizing Soviet or Russian-owned refineries in Germany. So I think, what Putin's got to look at is both at the success of the Ukrainian army and the dismal failure of the Russian army, but also of the solidarity, not just of the United States, but of Europe. And that makes it look, I think, really bleak from Moscow's perspective at the moment.
To which I would add, India and China just demonstrated that they have similar concerns about what's going on, and he has nowhere more to go. We'll see what happens to his political power. He's still very powerful, of course, inside Russia. No one should write him off anytime soon. There's just the possibility, of course, also that he may decide to throw a Hail Mary, as they say, and escalate in a way that people have long feared. We'll have to see, and of course we'll be back in the weeks and months ahead to see how this goes. In the meantime, I want to thank Philip Stevens, Giles Whittell, and Elise Labbott for a really excellent, if at times deeply gloomy conversation about the state of the world. But nevertheless, we're going to stick with that for this week. I want to thank all of you for joining, watching. Tune in again next week for another edition of A World Review. And until then, bon weekend.
Thank you. That's great.